Welcome back on the AM show. And of course, we continue with our conversation on that latest Hotline documentary put together by Isaac Kofi Ajay. And of course, it is Ghana, a nation that begs. We continue reflecting on the genesis of the situation and the different dynamics which explain why we are where we are currently. Our guests for this belt of the discussion, Dr. Saad Idrisu is an economist, Louisiana Economic Development. We also have Professor Charles Aka, Senior Research Fellow at ESSA, Dr. Arthur Kobina Kennedy. He's a political activist, and Dr. Abu Sakara Foster is founder of the National Interest Movement. Gentlemen, a very good morning to you. I've seen you, Dr. Abu Sakara Foster. I also see, all right, Dr. Saad Idrisu in there, Dr. Arthur Kennedy, and of course, Professor Aka as well. Gentlemen, we're so grateful that you've taken the time to join us this morning. Thank you.
Good morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Prof, I have not heard, I was just listening, doing this as a bit of a mic check as well to ensure everyone's microphone is working. Prof, good morning to you.
Thank you. Good morning.
All right. I can hear all of you. So here's how I want to premise the conversation for us to start. I'm sure all of us have followed the documentary piece. When you look at Ghana reflecting on how we've been begging, we have begged since independence, even before independence. We are begging, and if the foundation we have laid remains the same, if we keep building the same way, experts say we will continue to beg. But reflecting on how far we've come, our IMF flirtations, among others, what is your brief understanding of our economic situation and why we keep going back to the Bretton Woods institutions? That's the question I'll run by all of you for starters. In about a minute or two maximum, I would like your quick reflection on that before we get into other salient matters. I'll start with Professor Aka on that beat.
Okay. Good morning. Am I to start? Yes. So thank you very much, and good morning to all the panelists and your cherished listeners. So I think Ghana's situation is, purely the way I look at it, is not being able to put a handle on macroeconomic management and debt management strategy that is conducive for our development aspirations. Most of our years since independence we've been dependent on foreign aid. We have refused or unable to raise domestic capital to develop, and that has still been our problem after 65 years of independence. So when a country refuses to raise adequate domestic revenue, especially through taxation, but also through other fines and non-tax revenue, then the only way you can break the resource constraint is to depend on external capital. External capital comes normally from about 3 or 4 different sources. The most important one and most sustainable one is through export revenue. And again, the structure of our export and our trade has not been very sustainable, i.e. we have depended on 2 or 3 primary commodities for all these years. That does not give us adequate foreign exchange earnings in a sustainable way to develop. And the other source is through foreign direct investment. We have not built a competitive economy that is attractive to sustainable foreign capital. So the ones that we get are the greedy type, the hot money type that comes in mainly to our resource sector, oil, gold mining, and we have not even had proper capital control measures to make them sustainable and developmental. So they just come in and we don't get maximum benefit from it. And whenever there are crises, there's capital flight, they repatriate most of their capital or their profit. So that's another area which we have not managed I think, prudentially. The third source is through remittances. And again, that's also not sustainable. There are not too many Ghanaians that remit a lot of money, even though it's been growing over time. But we don't have much from remittances in a sustainable way that will help us to industrialize and to develop our economy. So then we are left with the last.
Did I hear you say we didn't have much from remittances? Because as we have heard, even in the COVID era and even before that, we get quite a chunk of money from remittances. Is it just that you're saying it doesn't suffice on the developmental scale? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, that's what I mean. On the developmental scale, the needs of the country is much. If you look at the road situation, the infrastructure situation in Ghana, remittances will not solve even 5% of it. If you want to construct railroads from Takoradi to Kumasi to Tamale airports, good hospitals and good schools, and fund proper research and industrialize agriculture, remittances that we are getting in Ghana is good, but is normally procyclical. It normally increases when we have crisis. Families are sending to their relatives. So it's not, tourism has not really been developed in a way that attracts huge sums of remittances. Other countries like the Philippines and some other countries have been serious about that. I don't think we are getting so much from that area. So basically, we have now resorted to borrowing, which is the fourth channel, which is international or external borrowing. And therefore, now that we say we are a middle-income country, lower middle-income country, you will see that the aid has dropped, and then we need to borrow. In the past, we used to borrow from the multilateral sources and the Paris Club, bilateral, government to government. But in recent past, we've gone much to private capital market, private credit, and that is, for me, the most dangerous part of our borrowing or debt management strategy. And we are borrowing at high interest rate, even though they are lower than the domestic rate. But because of the exchange rate problem, when you borrow dollars at a rate of about 10%, then you need to make sure that your return to investment or that you use the funds for should exceed 10%. So, and most of the time, when we borrow this foreign currency, we use it to support the budget or to refinance existing debt. We are not really investing it in a way that will get the return in any way around even 2%. When I last checked, since the 80s, most of our borrowings gives us a return between 0.8 to 1.4%. Okay, so, and we have to pay interest of around 9, 8, 10%. So basically you have a debt problem. The returns you get from the foreign loans you have taken, you are not investing it in a sustainable, productive way that gives you more profit or more returns to be able to pay your interest or even to service your interest. That is a big challenge. And that is, for me, how I analyze our problem. It is a non-efficient way, non-prudent way of managing our debt crisis. But when we look at debt sustainability, it's just kind of dividing the total debt stock over GDP. So at the current now, we say our debt to GDP is over 100%, around that. That means that one of the sustainable ways of having a sustainable debt profile is to grow the economy. So if the economy, for example, grows sustainably at 8, 9, 7% for a decade, you will see that the debt to GDP ratio all of a sudden falls. In fact, if we grow 2023, 2024 at about 7, 8%, debt to GDP will just reduce significantly. Our GDP is almost 800 billion. So if it grows at 10%, you add another 80 billion. Okay, so that's how it is. But over time, since independence, our GDP growth has averaged just around 4%. So we are not growing seriously. We are not investing in growth sectors. And our borrowing has exceeded our growth. So again, another sustainable way is to make sure that the economy grows faster than the rate of borrowing. Anytime the rate of borrowing exceeds your rate of growth,
Right.
you're going to have a crisis. So we are borrowing faster than we are growing the economy. You also have to make sure that the growth of your export is greater than the growth of your borrowing. We are borrowing faster than we are growing our export. So then it means that already, ab initio, you are going to have a debt crisis. When you borrow faster than your growth, GDP growth, you borrow faster than your export growth, and you are also borrowing and you're paying higher interest rate than your return to investment.
Okay.
Then you have a problem.
Prof, thank you so much for those initial comments. I want them to be bite-sized so we can all get a quick take and move around. So I'm going to pose that same question. I mean, I have already posed the question to the rest of you. I'll come now to Dr. Saad Idrisu for your bite, quick take on how far we have come, why we keep going back to the doorstep of the IMF. Quick reflections on that? Dr. Idrisu, are you online? Can you hear me?
No? Is it okay now?
I can hear you, sir.
Yes. I've been having a problem with the connection this morning. Good morning to you and good morning to my co-panelists as well as the listeners. Ben, there was one interesting part about the documentary when I was watching. I think that was with the one that Bright presented. When you looked at the history of the IMF bailout, something pricked my mind or something drew my attention to it in the sense that when you do all the calculations with regards to how much Ghana have gotten since 1966 all the way till now, it's about 3 billion. It's not even up to 4 billion in that analysis. Then all of a sudden, the country is going to take a 3 billion loan credit facility. I'm bringing this to explain the fact that it seems our constitution in general, the Ghanaian constitution, has given room to governments to borrow anyhow they like. When you have a constitution that doesn't have a limit, and I don't want to say the president, but the government in power could do anything at all they like, we are going to have debt crisis like this. Not just the current government, but even if you go back to look at all the previous data. Now, aside just the IMF bailout, come to the public debt itself. Look at the monetary policy report of Bank of Ghana. That's the January monetary policy report, January 2017. It's reported that as of November 2016, our total public debt stock was $30.1 billion. As at December 2022, it ballooned, it more than doubled to $63.3 billion. That is what is reported in the IMF report. So what does it tell you? Looking at this small data or looking at this comparison, it's telling you that we have a constitution that gives power to whoever is in office to do anything at all they like. And at that point in time, God forbid, if we have the case of Idi Amin, who can borrow up to $1 billion, they will definitely do that. And they will be within the legal limits of the law. They are not breaking any law, but they are putting the country in a debt crisis, but it's still legal. So when you are a growing nation, especially like an African nation, you don't make laws with so much loopholes that people in power could take advantage of. When people go on reckless borrowing to put the whole nation in a debt crisis, they are still within the legal framework. They are not breaking any law, but the nation is suffering. So that is one of the problems Ghana has been facing, I would say, since independence. The fact that we haven't been able to put a debt limit, a debt ceiling, or a debt cap on borrowing, so that we could show that if a government comes to power at least we are giving you 10 billion to borrow. Or we are giving you, okay, whatever the total debt stock is currently, you have an advantage to borrow at least 40% of that, 50% of that. Whatever that we as a country decides to do, I think it will prevent future recklessness of finance ministers.
Quick thought, Dr. Idrisu. Is that practical? Look at the United States, for example. They have their debt ceiling. In recent times, the Republicans have had to play ball with the Democrats just so that debt ceiling can be increased or pushed further up, just so there will not be chaos. Even the United States, with its, 30 plus trillion in debt. So how do you expect a country like Ghana, which is not even there, to be able to accommodate that?
That is what I was just coming to, because this particular issue that I'm bringing up, I brought it up on March 31st, 2022. That was last year, even before we got into this situation. When I analyzed the Bank of Ghana report and I saw the reckless borrowing that was going on, I raised this issue of March. I even sent it to your producers. I'm not sure if they will be able to put it on the screen right now for viewers to see. But you see, when I raised it, even at that time, the argument was that United States itself is suffering from that. United States, with their over 200 years of democracy, even still has a debt ceiling, which has just recently become an issue for discussion between the Republicans and the Democrats. Why will their democracy with over 200 years, why would they even have something like that in place? It's telling you that you cannot put powers in the hands of people and just expect them to do anything. They will do beyond what you even expect them to do. You understand? And again, Ben, the mistakes we Africans or the mistake we developing countries make is to always do what the textbook tells us. I believe it is high time our economists, I believe it is high time our policymakers shifts away from some of these theoretical economics and think outside the box for solutions that will be practical to our situation. So even if the whole world, no one is putting a debt ceiling, even if the whole world, no one is telling its government, okay, we are giving you 10 billion for the whole 8 years or for the whole term that you are in, at least Ghana could be an example. Because the figures that we are looking at, right, if we can go as a country from $30 billion in 2016, just in 7 years, we have doubled our national debts. So tell me, what can't any government do again, Ben?
All right.
So for instance, if President John Mahama comes in 2025 and decides that, okay, I'm doing 4 years, I want to borrow 100 billion. Is there any law to stop him? There isn't any law to stop him. If the finance minister comes and says that, okay, we can borrow 100 or 200 billion, there is no law to stop it. So at the end of the day, within that short period, they can borrow as much as they want. But you and I know that whatever that is borrowed within that short period, there isn't no value for money, because we are seeing it right now. If there was value for money for all the borrowing that has happened, we wouldn't even go back to IMF, because this current data that you are looking at, it tells you that the government has had enough resources. So my whole point is that we should start reflecting as a nation. Do we want to really put a cap on our leaders so that we wouldn't have Idi Amin coming into power to take advantage of the constitution, so that we wouldn't emburden the future generations with so much debt that they will still be in debt crisis? Because as at now, even with the IMF bailout and all that, if you look at the IMF own projections on page 35 of its report, we will still be in a debt crisis even as far as 2027. Even when the program is ending in 2025, our debt to GDP will be about 90.2. They are IMF own projections. So it's telling you that our debt situation is self-imposed. Let me put it that way.
Right.
Until we are able to put a cap, right, and limit on how much government borrows, government will not focus its attention on local generation of revenue. You see, I don't want to use the term laziness, but over the years, that is what it has turned governments into. Because, I mean, borrowing becomes the easiest way of raising revenue. So their attention is not actually on the domestic economy, how to be able to generate the economy, how to be able to stimulate the economy, such that the economy itself can provide enough revenue to support government projects. So the only thing that they have to do is to go out and borrow. When they go out and borrow, they come, implement projects, go back again and borrow. So they are not even watching enough to see even if the projects are generating any value to be able to pay for itself.
All right.
But if we start putting in that cap, right, believe me, we are going to bring government attention onto the domestic economy. Governments upon government will now start looking locally how to be able to stimulate sectors of the economy so that they will be able to generate revenue on its own.
Okay.
So doing that, we'll be able to even increase our imports.
Let me have you pause there and bring in Dr. Arthur Kennedy for his take before I bring in Dr. Busakara Foster. Dr. Arthur Kennedy, you've also followed our trajectory. You've lived longer than most of us. You've been there, done that. You're with the ruling administration. Why do you think we keep falling into this hole with the IMF? And when President Mahama said sometime in during his tenure, it had to be the last, around 2017, it had to be the last of IMF forays. But here we are again, back even before that time. What is your take? What is your reflection?
Yeah, good morning to your eminent panel and to my fellow Ghanaians. I think that most of the points that have been made are on point. First, our problem is expenditures versus revenue. The truth of the matter is, as others have pointed out, we don't raise enough revenue from taxes. And I think that our governments have discovered that it is easier to just borrow and spend than to tax and spend, because when you tax people, they ask questions. And when you go and borrow, it is really easy money and posterity will pay it. So we don't worry about it. I think at the root of this, it's not a crisis in the sense that, like all individuals, we must live within our means. When we say we must live within our means, it means that we should control government expenditure. That's the first thing we don't do. The size of our government is too bloated. We should not be having the size of government we have given our limited resources. We should live humbly. That is from our president to all our ministers. But more to the point, even when we borrow, our spending decisions are not made soundly. We waste a lot of money. Actually, when you look at Tony Blair's African report, they said that 25% of our procurement decisions are affected by corruption. It means that the money that we are borrowing is not all going to what we ought to be using them to do: good infrastructure, electricity, investing in people so that we get educated, productive people. We're not doing all those things. So at the end of the day, we don't even use the money that we borrow well. I know that one of the panelists said diaspora remittances is a pittance, but the fact of the matter is that just
that was
like
Professor
Aka.
Yeah.
Diaspora remittances also respond to good economic management. It has to be an attractive place so that when people remit their money, they can have good places to invest them, which will create jobs so that the private economy will grow. As one of the panelists pointed out, when the economy is growing, then the debt to GDP ratio gets better. So basically, if you ask me to sum it up, it boils down to we ought to spend less. Our governments need to be more accountable and smaller. We need to make better spending decisions. There needs to be less corruption. There needs to be transparency. And when we talk about the lack of controls, it's not that we don't have laws. It is just that the laws are not being enforced. I think Parliament ought to be doing executive oversight. All these loans are approved by the People's Parliament. So if they are approving all these debts and we think the debts are too much, then obviously something is happening somewhere. For example, since the beginning of the Fourth Republic, almost every government has embarked on a public housing project. It goes on for some time, they get it to 80, 90%, then they abandon it. And the next government comes, it goes to look for new revenue, it builds a public housing project, it gets to a certain stage, then they abandon it. And of course, if you are doing public procurement and 25% of it is due to corruption, and we saw what happened with the director of the Public Procurement Authority, forming a company and looting the public resources. I think the problem we have, in addition to not collecting enough resources, is that a lot of the aid money really is directed into private pockets to enrich private individuals who are serving at their own behest instead of at the public interest. And if we want to do something, we need to tackle that. And we also need to broaden the tax base so that more people will pay taxes, so we raise more domestic revenue. And one of the things that one of the panelists says that is true is that we need to make sure that all these people investing in mining and other sectors don't just come here, invest and repatriate their profits. We need to find a way of keeping more of their profits here. And we need to, of course, open up spaces like tourism so that more people from outside will come here, look at our history, look at our castles and others, and spend money. Even Canada, former Canadian Prime Minister Jean Chrétien said that in terms of return on investment, tourism is one of the best areas that one can look at. And we need to stop boneheaded policies like a national cathedral when we are broke. That is a symbol of irresponsible government, if ever there was one. So these are the problems that exist, and no nation has ever borrowed its way into prosperity.
Interesting points made. Dr. Foster, for you, this trajectory, how have we ended up here, and what are the dynamics you see? Hello, Dr. Abusakara Foster.
Yes, thank you very much, and good morning to my co-panelists. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to interact with you all. I think the first thing is that we must say the blunt truth as it is. Business cannot carry on as usual. We've borrowed up to the point where we're at the end of a precipice. The world has changed. We just can't keep on borrowing. And we've got to the end. And the next government in 2025 is going to be faced with very serious challenges. This fact must be known to everybody. So we can't even pretend that just because we've got this 3 billion, things are going to be smoothed over and life is going to carry on as usual, because that is still working in the mentality that we can keep borrowing and borrowing and borrowing. We've borrowed from low to middle income status. Now we expect that we will borrow from middle income status to high income status. And where does that take us? Because at the end of the day, something has to give. And we cannot compare ourselves to places like America and what have you. They have a big industrial base. They have big geopolitical control where they can, use influences around the world to assist their economy. So all of Africa, you're 3.5% of the total global trade. You're just a speck on the wall. So you don't have those influences. You don't have that, size of economy to be able to go through those kinds of challenges that they have with their big, debt ceilings. So we have to come to some basic understanding of where we stand right now. And I think all the presenters, without exception, have painted the picture graphically and in detail. And there's no argument with anybody. We've got to cut our coat according to our size. The question is, where are you going to do it? When are you going to do it? And how are you going to do it? Those are the issues that we now must face. Because at the end of the day, we can't say that this happened by accident. It was a deliberate choice. We took that choice to borrow this amount of money and balloon the debt beyond what it should be, because we thought through that we were going to get some, sudden change in the entire economy. It was a miscalculation because, of course, nobody knew COVID was coming along. Nobody knew Ukraine war was coming along. But all the same, that's why one should be always cautious and you don't overdo things where you cannot retrieve your position. So at the end of the day, we are where we are now because we made a gross miscalculation in the amount we should have borrowed and how we borrowed it at that time. Now we're in the grip of our debtors. And let's not forget, the debt situation is not just about making money. It's really about controlling the way your country grows in order that it will favor those people who lend you that money and their investors. What has been the most significant effect of our borrowing since we started this journey of ours in Ghana? The most significant effect has been that it has stripped us of all our national industries because they've been privatized. And now we're on a, what I'll say, shopkeeper's economy, where we're just trading, selling, and buying things. We still have our, small revenue from extractive resources, etc. But it is way below what we need to meet our public sector payments. So if you don't have that, and those initial investments, those initial outlays you made in industry, etc., which would have generated money, we don't have that as well. And then we're having imposed on us very high taxation, very high cost of energy, very high transaction costs. It's like running on a treadmill, which can run faster than you. You will run and run and run. When you get tired, it will kick you off. That's the bottom line. So we shouldn't have any illusion that we'll be able to keep running on this dead treadmill and then we'll make ground and gain ground. No, that is not going to happen. That is not going to happen.
Right.
So at some stage, we have to stop, take stock, and say, look, let's cut our coat according to our size. Let's look at we're not saying we're not going to borrow money, but let's look at how we borrow money. Let us have a national development plan in segments. And within that segment, it tells you what you can borrow that money for and how much you should borrow that money for. We have steadfastly refused to have such a plan and believe in manifestos, which we make ad hoc according to what our electoral promises say. And then we want to rule government by that. Anybody who has made progress has always had a plan. And they don't rule their country according to manifestos. If they're manifestos, they're about how you execute that plan, which is predetermined, and how you cost it to make sure you're doing it cost effectively. It's not about plucking promises from the sky and vote-winning promises, which you know very well are going to land you into trouble at the end of the day. And nothing's changing. Begin looking at the campaign promises as we go into 2024. You'll see whether we have learned anything or not.
Interesting thoughts. And that final point you made about going into 2024 and what we ought to be looking at, I will bring to all of you at the end of this conversation. But coming to you, Professor Aka, you look at the fact that we got debt forgiveness to the tune of about $6 billion during John Ajakum Kufuor's time. I'm talking about HIPIC. We were declared a highly indebted poor country. Some say we are even in a worse situation, in an even worse situation now. But is there any justification on the back of the early 2000s, around 2004, and the assistance we got? We were the second, if you look at the rank of countries, in terms of our debt forgiveness vis-a-vis our gross domestic product. Yet, just a few years down that road, we went begging the IMF again. Almost every 4 to 6 years, we go back to the IMF. Are we justified, or are we just led by mismanagers? What is your take?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the truth of the matter, and I think Dr. Abu Zakara said it, it's time for us to begin to speak the truth to ourselves. That, to be honest with you, since the 1960s, since the overthrow of President Kwame Nkrumah, I think we have had very bad governance. And I'm worried about that. I'm not even much concerned about our generation and our time. Many of us are getting old. But I'm concerned about our children and grandchildren, and we don't seem to be doing anything serious that will give them hope. Many people talk to me, in fact, in the last 2 years since the crisis began. I've had students, teaching the university, asking whether there's hope in Ghana. And everybody wants to leave the country. Many people I've spoken to. People are already trying to get Canadian citizenship and other things. Doctors and professionals are leaving. I have many colleagues who refuse to come back to Ghana when I made a choice to come. So, I don't think it's good. Much of our politics has been irrational and capricious and corruption and mismanagement. And I think that's what has brought us here. And that's the truth of the matter. And you can trace back. So if you go back to 1960, Ghana was better off than Malaysia and South Korea, for example, or at par in terms of GDP per capita. And see where Malaysia and South Korea are now. Okay, Malaysia is an upper middle income country. GDP per capita is close to $12,000 per capita. They are aiming by 2030 to be a high income country. South Korea is already a high income country. GDP per capita is above $30,000. Okay. And Ghana, we are still GDP per capita less than $2,500. And over the last 65 years, the things Malaysia has done, the things South Korea has done, in terms of macroeconomic management, industrialization, infrastructure, we have come nowhere near that. So we need to question ourselves, what kind of people are we voting into power? And what are the checks and balances? And sometimes I blame we, the voters, as we are part of it. We are talking about elections. This democracy, it has failed. We are talking about...
Are you suggesting our brand of democracy has failed, or democracy in itself is not out? I mean, let's get into the conversation of whether democracy is even good for us. And I know this is a tricky conversation. Democracy vis-a-vis what other things may exist. Rwanda, Singapore may come to mind. But is democracy working for us? Is it the way to go in Ghana?
It's the way to go, but it's not working at the moment because the institutions have failed. You know, when Obama came here, he said, what Africa needs is strong institutions. You know, a book that was written by some of the economists, Asimeglu and co. So institutions. So we need to look at all our economic institutions, our governance institutions, start from the central bank, come to the parliament, come to the Council of State, come to the fiscal institution, Minister of Finance, and look at all our institutions, look at our state-owned enterprises, and see whether they are performing. And look at even civil society organizations, whether they are checking government. Look at the special prosecutor. Look at all of that, judiciary. Are they doing what they are supposed to do? You see, if you look at our constitution, under the directive principles of state policy, economic objective, and section 36, the state shall take all necessary action to ensure that the national economy is managed in such a manner as to maximize the rate of economic development and to secure the maximum welfare, freedom, and happiness of every person in Ghana, and to provide adequate means of livelihood and sustainable employment and public assistance to the needy. Are we doing that? We have a state over the last 65 years that maximize the rate of economic development and secure maximum welfare and freedom and happiness of every person. We have youth unemployment is about 33%. Every 10 youth you see, almost 4 of them are unemployed. I have graduate students with first class who have graduated from economics, business administration, 5-7 years, no job.
And even for those who get work, there is underemployment. In other words, the person studied something, but what they are having to do is very far from what they studied.
So we need to ask our question, over these last 65 years, are we even following the Constitution? That how do we hold government, the state, accountable to raise enough resources domestically and even to borrow prudentially, externally, that they invest in the economy to give hope to our children, our grandchildren, so that they can have hope. You cannot have a situation like that where people are easily going to government. I have, university professors now are getting into politics. People have just realized that if you want to make it in Ghana, you must join them. Okay, so because even if you're a university professor, the state is not ensuring that it's paying you adequately or even giving research. See, I've been a researcher and a lecturer in the University of Ghana since 2007. Ask over the last 15, 16 years, how much has the state given me to conduct research? Almost every research I've conducted has to be funded by international donors. I have to write research proposal and get grant from foreign government. The government give research grant, or what they call book and research allowance, less than $2,000 a year for research for professors in the university, public university. What are they going to do with that? Even the research that is conducted is never used. So I think that we have a fundamental problem, and I think there's a political economy problem. Economic is not enough to solve it. Our politics and our governance is too capricious, is too irrational, illogical, and I think it's just self-serving. And we need to look at the Constitution and have a second look at our institutions of governance and whether they are fit for purpose, and whether the parliament is properly doing their work of checking the executive. Now it has just become politics, NDC, MPP, and I don't think it's helping us at all. For me, that's where I am. But when you come back to asking for law, I think my colleague was saying that we need law to regulate borrowing, and I support that. But I think that...
Do you also support a debt ceiling? Do you support a debt ceiling?
I support a debt ceiling, but I think we should start from external debt ceiling, not domestic. Because, yes, the domestic, like TBs, for example, will still be needed for short-term management. But at any point, we can set a ceiling of maybe 70% per GDP. But what has caused our problem since independence has not been over borrowing from domestic resources. When government borrow domestically, they can almost always pay it in several ways, and it's not a problem. The worst case scenario is through printing money. And that has not been, our crisis we have had has always been a balance of payment problem. It has always been our inability to raise enough foreign exchange to service our foreign exchange obligations. So that's where the problem is. It is mainly because we borrow too much externally and we don't raise enough external revenue in terms of export or revenue or remittances or foreign direct investment to service the debt. If you look at the crisis we're having now, in fact, the domestic debt exchange was almost totally unnecessary. It was because the IMF demanded it, because we needed to go to do external debt restructuring. And
so quickly on this point, you're saying we should focus in terms of a debt ceiling on the external, not local debt. But how about borrowing, for example, from the central bank? That in itself is also a thorny situation, Just addressing that, how should we approach it moving forward? Just wrap on that, and then I'll bring in Dr. Idrisu.
Okay. I'm of the view, I've spoken at length on that matter of the central bank financing, and I will write upon it again. I am of the view, you see, the textbook situation is that central bank financing or money printing leads to inflation. And I said, no, it's not true, it's a myth. And it also depends on the conditions and what the borrowing is used for. There's no country, in fact, even from Britain to the US currently, and to all the Asian countries that developed and industrialized, and the central bank did not finance massively or was not involved. So, and if you look at our records, and I can show you, if there was time, I would have shown you a graph and an analysis I've done. The causes of inflation in Ghana has not mainly been central bank financing or what they call fiscal dominance or monetary dominance. It has not been. It has mainly been because our inflation is lack of agriculture. Inflation is mainly food inflation in Ghana and mainly imported inflation. So when we failed, and I thought Dr. Abu Zakara will speak upon that because he's one of the respected people I thought when he was campaigning to become president, had some good ideas on agriculture. There's no way Ghana will develop if we don't come back to invest massively in agriculture and through agriculture to solve our food needs and to be self-sufficient in food, because that's what will control inflation. And then we will stop importing poultry and rice and many of the things, tomatoes and things that we import into this country. That is one of the first places to start our development. That's where our problem is coming from. We are using scarce resources in importing food that should have been produced in this country. We have paid lip service to agriculture. So if we got central bank, for example, to let's say give government, we have to have a bipartisan agreement. NDC, MPP, central bank, we have a National Development Planning Commission sit down. We say we will need, let's say, 10 billion Ghana cedi, 50 billion Ghana cedi to industrialize agriculture, labor-intensive agriculture. And we get that money from the central bank and we invest it into oil palm, into cocoa, into rice, into poultry. I don't see how that causes inflation. It doesn't make sense to me. If it's not going to lead to import and it's not going to be used to support the budget or to give people to buy V8 and things, and it's going to solve, food crisis problem and to industrialize the rural economy, that should actually, in the medium to long term, solve our inflation problem. It will keep inflation at less than 5-6%. And that's what Korea did. That's what Japan did. That's what Malaysia did. If you go to Malaysia, you drive through everywhere in Malaysia. In fact, when you are in the air, you will see oil palm tree all over the country. They make more money from oil palm than cocoa. In fact, they have stopped cocoa. Oil palm or palm oil is a whole factory and industry.
But again, from the developmental angle, I'll have to take you. You know why oil palm production is also in some places inhibited or controlled? Because it is sort of an invasive species, so to speak. In the sense that when people start cultivating oil palm, everything else goes. And the fear is that if you overdo oil palm, the cocoa industry, for example, could suffer. It could go under. I'm sure you're well aware of that as well, which is why the oil palm situation is a bit tricky. In those countries you reference, they have faced similar problems.
No, it's a choice. It's a development choice. They saw that oil palm is more profitable than cocoa. So they substituted oil palm for cocoa. And they have built a whole industry. In fact, if you look at just Google Malaysia and see how much export revenue they get from the oil palm sector, it's massive. It's more than we get from gold, cocoa, oil in Ghana. So there's no need for us to stick to cocoa, which is collapsing anyway. We are not investing in cocoa. What is Cocoa Board doing? How much fertilizer? What are they doing to the cocoa farmers? We have not reached our target. We can't have 2 million tons. Cocoa farmers are poor, and now they are going to, Galamsey is destroying the whole cocoa. So I don't see the argument. We need agriculture. If it's not oil palm and it's cocoa, fine. But we need to invest in cocoa, process the cocoa to make sure that we get enough export revenue from it. If it's not cocoa and it's soybean or is whatever agricultural product, what I'm saying is that we need to solve our great problem. It's fundamental. A country that cannot feed itself, They have to import everything or most of the things they consume. Cannot develop. And agriculture is the place to industrialize. Industrialization must be based on agro-industrialization. And it will never be private sector alone. It needs to be de-risked, which means that the government needs to take the lead. The government must be entrepreneurial. It must be state that also goes in to provide. Look at loans. How can you borrow at 30, 40% to do farming? Go to my village. They take loans of almost 40%. Farmers take loans of almost 40% from the rural bank.
Right.
And then they're supposed to pay that in 1 year. Can never do that. They don't do that in the US. They don't do that in Canada. Go and check Saskatchewan. So you borrow at almost 0% or 0.5%, 1%. And then you have about 5-10 years to pay. That's how we take serious industrialization programs.
And I couldn't agree with you more, especially roping in the National Development Planning Commission. But Dr. Idrisu, look at our interesting picture as a country. It's befuddling. So we've made ourselves international beggars. We are the typical fool surrounded by water, yet thirsty. We are now the #1 gold producer in Africa, and some would say by extension, looking at our production globally. We've ousted South Africa, which took over in 2021. We're the #2 world leading producer for cocoa. In fact, about a year ago, I don't know about currently, but we were the #1 exporter of yam anywhere in the world. The trajectory shows that we have what it takes. Natural resources, population, and a working population. I'm talking labor here. So we have the tools for industrialization. We have the manganese and bauxite that will be used in the steel industry for rapid industrialization. We have timber. Of course, Galamsey is also playing its negative role. Diamonds, oil, lithium. We have everything. So my questions then to you. Why do we still beg? Why have we not broken the cycle of begging? How do we get out? Dr. Idrisu. Is Dr. Saad Idrisu with us?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Please go ahead.
Yes, I'm saying that to be able to do that, we need to revisit what I was emphasizing on. You see, we haven't developed our laws enough to be able to hold leaders accountable. And when you have such loose laws, believe me, anybody at all that you put in there, at the end, will end up being corrupt. At the end, will end up doing what you least expect that they will even do. So that is why I'm telling you that if you go back to look at all our borrowing history, we've had HIPC that, were forgiven through the debt swaps and all that, but still we ended up back again in the debt crisis. So it tells you that until we are able to put a cap on borrowing, and Ben, I don't want to even take it as the American system. We can design a total different system. That is why I said I have been talking about this excessive borrowing since March last year, 2022, that we should stop it. We should put a limit on borrowing. That is the only way that we'll be able to focus on the domestic economy by looking at our gold, by looking at our cocoa, because currently what we have is that we have all these natural resources, but at the end of the day, the revenue doesn't even stay in Ghana. How many Ghanaian companies, local companies, are actually into our gold mining, into our oil production? That is the question that we should ask. So if you have all these industries, that at the end of the day, they are only capital flies. You can never develop your domestic economy. You always resort to borrowing. See, the textbook economics will tell you that you should borrow or you should be able to raise taxes. All the time, raise taxes. We have raised taxes to cripple businesses in Ghana. Right now, businesses are moving to Cote d'Ivoire and neighboring countries, waiting for the next government to come in 2025 and they will come back. We have crippled our own savings system. with too much taxes on government employees, because basically they pay most of the taxes, to the point that they are not even able to save enough to be able to think of even doing something meaningful with them. That is why I said these are all textbook economics. Do Saudi Arabia tax its citizens? Do they even have income tax in Saudi Arabia? Do they even have sales tax? Qatar, Dubai, UAE, do they even have sales tax or income tax? So we have to look into our local economy and see how to move away from just the textbook or the theoretical economics, what they are telling us to do. Because if taxes are so good, Dubai, Qatar, all these Middle East countries, or all these Arabian countries, they will have imposed taxes on their citizens.
So two angles to look at. Sorry for intervening in your train of thought.
I'm not saying taxes is not good. Let me be frank, because as an economist, I believe in taxes, but over taxation will end up crippling the economy. That is why I said we have to really move away from theory into practice. Let's not look at what the textbook is telling us to do. Let's look at our local economy. Because Malaysia didn't develop by going through the textbook scenario, borrow taxes. Saudi Arabia is not doing that. Qatar is not doing that, right? And all the resources that you have, been counting, they have it too. How have they been able to manage their oil revenue such that you and I will even want to go to Dubai and do our shopping because it's tax-free? Why can't we have such a system? So it tells you that until we are able to stop our leaders from excessive borrowing, they will never put their attention on the domestic economy. And again, there's something interesting about, especially like the IMF bailout. Observe something. In 1999, we took 300 million, right? Towards 2000, which was an election year. Then if you come back again, 2003, we went back to IMF and took 244.7. 24 was an election year. Is that not it?
Right.
2015, we went and we took 900 million. Then 2016 was an election year. Now, 2023, we are seeking 3 billion, and 2024 is going to be an election year. So there is it's like we are not really borrowing to stabilize the economy. We are borrowing for an election purposes. Let's be straightforward with that.
Okay.
And believe me, 2024 election, mark it on the wall. There will be more money in the system. Just mark it on the wall. And NDC is not going to have it easy with MPP. Because whatever funds coming in is purposely geared towards election. I will say it plain and simple. Because that has been the trend of our IMF bailout since 1999 all the way to date. You understand? So if we don't go back to the laws, the root cause, whereby we can say that, hey, you cannot come in as a government and do whatever you want with our future. Because at the end of the day, if the government decides to double our national debts in 7 years, if a government decides to double or triple our national debts in 4 years, they will live with their family rich. But your generation, our grandchildren, my grandchildren, our kids, they will suffer the impact. So whilst children in Malaysia will grow up to a beautiful economy, our children or our grandchildren will grow up in a debt crisis economy where unemployment will thrive. And again, as Prof rightly said, I totally agree with agriculture. Believe me, we can't move forward until we are able to feed ourselves. You cannot attain economic sovereignty on hunger. That is never done.
Right.
You cannot attain economic sovereignty on other people's food. That is food import. That is never done. Look at even US. Even US, the textbook, they tell you that US doesn't subsidize their farmers. But they do. They have different ways of doing it. So why would they come to Ghana and tell us that we should remove subsidies for our farmers? Then we will go by what they say.
Again, I guess the point of just following hook, line, and sinker, what is profit for us, without contextualizing.
Exactly.
Right.
Because whoever that feeds you definitely controls you.
Right. Let me just let you pause there. Hold your horses. Let me bring in Dr. Arthur Kennedy for this is the penultimate batch. Once we are done, once I do Dr. Kennedy and Dr. Foster, then I'll go to the final question, which will run across for all of you, and then we'll cap off the conversation. But some messages coming through. This one is from Junior, who says, JoyNews, I want his social media handle. That is Professor Charles Akka. I want to start following him. So, Professor Akka, when I come to you later, you can give us your social media handles. If you're on social media, someone wants to follow you. But Ankida Punabantu says, the problem is government budgets are always running into deficit. What is needed are budget surpluses and pumping those surpluses as low-interest concessionary loans for the private sector to use. Makes some sense. Are budgeting and always overshooting it. Of course, if you have 1 CD every year, or if you earn 1 CD and you're spending 2 CDs, it means the extra money must come from somewhere. It means you're also going to be always fettered to indebtedness. But to you, Dr. Kennedy, your administration, the party to which you belong, before coming into power, the vice president now said they were going to move from taxation to production. And we hailed that because that was the way to go. But today, even sanitary products, and I'll keep mentioning this till the taxes on sanitary products are lifted. Sanitary products attract about 35% in taxes. We are taxing periods. Today, there's a story in the Daily Graphic about that same incident. We're taxing periods, menstruation not by choice. And we're considering it a luxury, actually, 35%. Import tax, VAT. Kenya has done away with it, Nigeria has done away with it, Rwanda, other countries have done away with it. We still impose these taxes. So then, from that end, how do we actually get to production and move away from what Dr. Saad Idrisu calls over-taxation? How do we get there? What's your thinking?
Well, taxing sanitary products is bogus economics.
You say it's what? Bogus economics?
It's bogus economics. We shouldn't be taxing that. To comment on some of the things said, though, the U.S. has a debt ceiling, but they breach it repeatedly. Actually, the debate we just saw was a debate about raising the debt ceiling. So if the Republicans had not been there, every Democrat would have voted for it and would have gone along. So it means that checks and balances are important. And the U.S., of course, has agricultural subsidies. They brag about it. Senators and congressmen from farm states brag about how much subsidies they bring to their farmers. So when we are listening to them, we should also people who pay taxes in Ghana are paying too much. We need to lower the tax rates and broaden the tax base. I think that's what our problem is. We need to tax people less and tax more people, bring more people in the informal economy into the formal economy so we can raise more revenue. I think the comment on agriculture is right on point. Actually, it was said in about 2005 by the Blair Commission that at that time, Africa was spending about $50 billion a year importing food, and now it's gotten to about 60, getting to 65. So certainly, domestic agriculture is very important, and that goes to effective governance, that we should invest in agriculture, and it's not just pumping money into it. Ushu Efria Kutu brags about how much money they pumped into agri, and we can find the money. So it's not just pumping money into it, to be responsibly and having accountability. Good governance is at the heart of everything. And when Obama said we need strong institutions, yes, he was right, but strong institutions don't come on their own. They are built. Munez said that nothing is possible without strong institutions, but you need strong individuals to build the strong institutions so that when they become strong enough, then they can overcome individuals who will lead us astray. I think the fundamental problem we have is bad governance. Governments that are too big, governments that are too corrupt, governments that have the wrong priorities. And I agree with you. We're heading into 2024. There's going to be more spending. We're going to have larger budget deficits, and we'll be on our way to the next IMF place with our cap in hand, begging for more things. I think we should embrace the diasporans, treat them better, reform our economy so more of them will bring resources in. We should tighten our belt, and we should hold our politicians accountable. We have seen the enemy, and he is us because we vote for them. So we cannot vote for them to do what they are doing and then turn around and complain. All this money they spend during election years, they spend them trying to bribe us. So they borrow in our name, they come bribe us, we vote for them, they go into office, they loot our resources, and then before we turn around, we're going back to begging once again. So we have seen the enemy and he is us. If we're going to do something, we need all to stand up and hold the governments accountable, both MPP and NDC. They have failed us. Parliament is not working. Everybody knows that. The judiciary is not working. They have become an effective enforcement tool for the government. Those fighting corruption are being victimized with the full cooperation of the judiciary. Before we move forward, we need accountability.
Let me bring in Dr. Abu Sakara Foster. When you give your take on this, then I'll take the final word from each one of you in about a minute, and it's a wrap to the conversation. Dr. Foster, so how far we've got now, we have been talking about the economy from different facets, but how about the spin-off or the knock-off effect of previous administrations? Recently, the World Bank country director was talking about the fact that some of those power purchase agreements of the erstwhile Mahama administration had also led to some great cost to our country and knocked the economy. The minority has come out forcefully against that, with making quite a bit of sense. But looking at the different dynamics, what is your take on that? Especially as now we're being told that what was deemed as excess capacity up to 2021, now we don't even have excess capacity anymore. Now we're going to need more capacity because guess what? Like Nkrumah did, he planned for much more capacity when our population was around 5-point-something million, almost 6 million. And that is what Akosombo still serves us with over 30 million people. Doomsor is looming large. The energy people, power people are saying that if we don't get things right with the IPPs, independent power producers, and even get more on board, we could get back to that point. Why am I putting all this together? Because those things have a way of knocking our economy. Imagine having to go get more independent power producers at more cost, impacting our economy even more in the coming years. What is your take on that angle? How do we deal with it?
Well, you've asked me, so I'll speak to it, although I wanted to speak to some of the other issues that people raised, but I'll speak to this.
So maybe in the final point I'll give you, right after this batch, the final bit you can address.
Okay. I think the first thing is that don't take everything that the World Bank says as gospel truth. If you go around the World Bank's history all over Africa, you will find plenty cases where they've always advised governments against doing that. And finally, those governments who refused and went ahead and did it, Tazara Railways from Mombasa all the way down became the lifeline of the East and Southern African countries, and yet they said it shouldn't be done. Our own Akosombo Dam was said, no, it's too bad, an ambitious project, it shouldn't be done, but it became our lifeline. So what you have to understand is that you are wanting to break out of a stranglehold and develop at your own pace. Other institutions, they will want you to keep developing, but perhaps not at the pace you want to develop, so that you don't break out. It's as simple as that. So if you keep taking that medicine, it will be like Delilah shaving Samson's hair.
Are you suggesting the
time.
IMF, the Bretton Woods institutions are in themselves some sort of trap?
Of course they are. I mean, they are a bank. What does a bank do? Are you with me?
Yeah.
They're a bank. They have their vested interests. And, you know, all the privatization that we have had done and sold off our state assets, who has come to buy those state assets? Invariably, it's their own companies that have come back to pick them up. And why is it that they're always so concerned when their competitors are getting into our economies? If the Chinese are coming in here, they're building that, you mustn't be dealing with the Chinese. But if their companies are doing it, that's okay. I'm not suggesting that we go with one or the other. All I'm telling you is that look after your own interests and follow your own plan for the rate at which you want to grow. And that means you have to begin looking at the fundamentals and investing to create a firm foundation for growth. You can't grow out in the air over there. Which brings me to a key point that I want to make regards from Kufuor's time when we had that debt forgiveness. You know, the most important part about the debt forgiveness was not the quantum of debt forgiven. It was what was done with the money that was forgiven, because the terms of that debt forgiveness required that money to be pumped into rural areas and invested in infrastructure and projects that raise the standard of living. And that is why up till today, a lot of people recognize that era as one of the best eras after the Nkrumah era, because everybody was feeling the growth from the bottom up. Now, come back to the era where now we're looking at the explosion of this debt and the alternatives that we had. We were just finding oil. You know that most of our problems came when we found oil. As soon as we found that oil, people thought that, oh, now we can borrow to the hilt. And they started doing it. And that if we hadn't had that oil, first of all, when you went to borrow, who would have allowed you to borrow that much? But now, because we had that oil, we'll pay with oil in 10 to 15 years' time.
Yeah.
So we jumped.
Another aspect is Dutch disease.
Yes. So now, the point I'm making here is that it goes back to the agriculture link. You see, these things don't stand alone. A country doesn't develop in silos. One decision affects another. If we had managed our palm oil like Malaysia did, and they got it from us, they use their palm oil to fund their oil industry. By that meaning that they've invested their own money in that and they bought the technical expertise. If we had had our money from palm oil, we wouldn't have had only 5-6% of our oil income now. We would have been using our own money to invest in that oil, and we would have built up the expertise, which will mean that our local content and the income that will remain in the country from that industry will be greater. So these one decision has a consequence along the road, and it affects so many other things because they're integrated.
Right.
And when we come down to talking about funding for agriculture, it's plain and simple. Until you have a separate window for lending to agriculture and industry, you can talk and have all the fancy programs you like. You will not see the kind of growth that transforms agriculture along the chain from the small-scale farmers to the largest scale farmers, from low mechanization to high mechanization, from low productivity to high productivity. You will not see that because agriculture needs a special window around the nature of the business, and also because it is a public good. One of the things and that's why I like this comment that my colleague is making, that you can't go by the textbook economics. There are things in agriculture which are perceived as private goods, but they're actually public goods. If I build an irrigation system to my farm, yes, it's going to come and service my farm, but it's a public good. It is not a private good. It's the same way you travel on your car to the office. The water travels to my farm. I should pay for the water, yes, but I shouldn't pay for the infrastructure for the water. And if you want to know the truth of it, go to Israel and find out if any farmer pays for infrastructure. Go to other countries and find out if they don't get rebates for the infrastructure, which means that they're now operating, paying only for the water and their inputs, and competing against you, who has to borrow money at high interest rates, invest it in infrastructure, which is a long term, and then come and compete with them. That's
right.
Why you cannot even produce and capture your own market.
Right.
And then you want to compete with who? So these fundamentals must be got right.
All right.
If you don't get it right, and I can't emphasize this enough, it's like running on a conveyor belt. which is going at a speed which you can't maintain. You can pretend for a while that you can do it, but sooner or later you'll get tired. And we all know what happens when you get tired on a conveyor belt. And that is why you keep having to get IMF to put you back on the conveyor belt.
Right. There's a lengthy message here from Ankida Punabantu about the Zambian example and looking at the budget, looking at the deficit, spreading across taxation, minimally across the population, the taxable population, and making the most of the situation over time to ensure that you bridge your deficit and then you get surpluses and pump them into the economy. It's rather lengthy. I'm just trying to summarize as well as I can. It's a very long piece. Abubakar Latif says, this is mostly because we're afraid to tell the truth. You and I know the causal agents for this shaky economy. Our leaders always share among themselves and no auditing, whatever, not to talk of prosecuting culprits. Junior says, I didn't know we had all these elite thinkers in the country. JoyNews, thank you for the panelist selection. You are very unique. Keep it up. It was through your channel I got to know, you say, Professor Jampo, Adam Bona and co. You are doing well, Benjamin and co. All right, we're grateful for those kind thoughts. Gentlemen, to wrap the conversation, I'll give you about a minute each, please, for the sake of time. Let's stick to it. I'll start with you, Professor Aka. Heading into 2024, we're going to the polls again, and the politicians will come knocking on our doors. They will be on your TV screens, on your radio, in the newspapers. They will come eating with you, pounding fufu with you, cooking banku with you. But what should we be looking out for in terms of our economy and going beyond the IMF? What should we be looking at? 1 minute each, gentlemen. Professor Aka.
Well, thank you very much. In terms of what we should be looking out for, it depends on what is available. I mean, our politics has become almost two-party. And many times you don't have a choice, really. You may decide not to vote or to choose between what is available. In the place where I live, for example, we have changed. I mean, every 4 years we move from NDC MPP. We've never had an MP that from one party for more than 4 years, but we still haven't seen real development for all these years I've lived here. So we have a problem, but I just think what we need is trustworthy people. At least if they don't have what it takes to develop their country, there must be people who are also not going to steal and not going to be people who can be trusted. So let's look for the best. I think we need to move away from NDC MPP and look for the best that the country has. Actually, this country has a lot of good people. I met, and one of my disappointment came. I used to meet the MPs in Koforidua after every budget was read to try to do a presentation of an analysis of the budget to give them more understanding for their budget debate. And I think in one of the conversations, I was telling them that I thought our political economy was not giving us the best. When we Ghana football, we are playing World Cup, we don't look at MPP and DC. We look at who is a Ghanaian and is a good player all over the world. We go and look for them and bring them to come and play for Ghana. And I think that's the thing we need to do. That's what Singapore did. And that's what countries that have developed did. We will still have NDC MPP. But for God's sake, if we want to develop this country, we must look at who we put in ministerial positions. And I'm afraid that some of the people we have appointed as ministers or CEOs of state-owned enterprises, they cannot manage a farm. They don't have what it takes. But because of our politics, nepotism, and here and there, we just put people there. And I think that's not giving us the best. Let's look at the best as if this Ghana is a black star. And It doesn't matter if somebody is MPP or NDC. And let's bring them. Some of them may not be involved in politics. I can name 2-3 good economists, more than me. Some of them taught me economics, and they are still there. They don't belong to NDC MPP. Nobody has put them even on a board. They could have been on the board of Central Bank or board of Ministry of Finance somewhere, but because they don't have a party card, So that is, in terms of, all of us are responsible for that.
Right.
And I think we need to change. But finally, in terms of IMF, to be honest with you, the IMF package is not going to give us much. And I think my colleague already said, if you look at their own projections, even by 2027, we will still be almost going back to the IMF again. I think honestly, what we need to do is to have another almost century consensus. Bring all the brains together, academia, civil society, both political parties, all political parties, and let's look at all the economic departments we have in the country, all the big universities, business schools, governance, political science, and let's sit down and let's work with the National Development Planning Commission. So what kind of Ghana do we want in the next 20, 25 years for our children? And then let's put our heads together. And I think we can have a homegrown solution that is better than what IMF is giving us.
Professor Aka, we're so grateful that you've taken the time to join us this morning. Dr. Saad Idrisu, it's your turn now. Please manage the time for us if you can. Dr. Idrisu.
Yes, can you hear me?
I can.
Yes, since you are ending the discussion on politics, let me say that looking at the current economic crisis, if Ghanaians are to vote on the economy and not on religion, not on ethnicity or tribes, then we'll say that John Mahama will be the next president. And in that case, I would like President John Dramani Mahama to put a cap on government borrowing when he comes to power in 2025. That should be the first policy he should implement if we really mean well for the development of Ghana and not just for the selfish interests of politicians. Number two, I would like President John Dramani Mahama in 2025 to implement Youth in Agriculture program in Ghana. Youth in Agriculture program, not NDC politics or not NDC grassroots in agriculture, like we had with the case of the planting for food. We must have a purely national policy whereby we encourage the youth to go into agriculture, large-scale agriculture. See, the Ghanaian youth, after completing degree, is expecting an office job. It's like a mindset. We have to change that. We have to put government policy in place to be able to change that. So that once youth are able to go into agriculture, we'll have much more to even feed our nation and think of export. Right. And the third aspect, this why it doesn't just go to John Dramani Mahama or any, I mean, it goes to all of us as citizens. We have to respect the youth. See, let me tell you, Ben, I've been speaking on economic issues since the government took power. I'm less than 40 years. And if you go back to what I've said, a lot of them has even occurred before, I said them, you understand? And some of them, I've even said them even before it comes to power. I mean, it comes into being, like the excessive government borrowing I was talking of. Since March, I've been speaking about that, only for us to find ourselves in this debt situation. We have to respect the youth, the knowledge from the youth. We have to move away from this, the person must be old before they could speak to government. Right. Someone being less than 40 years doesn't mean that the person doesn't have the knowledge to advise government. In other jurisdictions, less than 40-year-olds are becoming leaders of their countries. Are becoming president. But in Ghana, I've had people call me, we just check your age on Google. You are even less than 40. What has it got to do with what I am talking about for the development of Ghana? We have to, our older generation need to really respect the youth and put people in proper positions. Like one of the panelists said, some of the ministers, believe me, if they had given such positions even to the youth, they could have been done better. Right. We've had people, government comes into power, they will look at the person's age and say, you cannot be a finance minister. What has age got to do with running a finance ministry? Or what has it got to do with running different portfolios? And the older ones who have run the ministries, the older ones, how have they fared? The older ones, how have they fared? So that is my hope, people. We have to start respecting the youth and the knowledge that they bring on board. We shouldn't just be Googling their ages and speaking as if, because they are young, they cannot speak on national development. That is not how countries develop. You develop based on knowledge. You develop based on theories.
All right.
And finally, I will say that we must really look at our local economy and provide solutions to the local economy, aside from the textbook situation. Saudi Arabia, other countries, they are doing that. Qatar and co, they are doing that. That is why they don't have income tax. That is why they don't have sales tax. We can do similar thing. I'm not saying we should cancel taxes, but we should reduce taxes to be able to stimulate business growth. That is why I say you can do your checks.
All
Businesses
right. I have to cap it off here, Dr. Idrisu. Before I do the next two, Junior is just reminding me, they want your social media handles. I don't know whether you can share, Professor Aka, if you're still on, just so I don't lose you. Professor Aka, if you're with us, do you have a social media handle?
I don't really have, but I think maybe I have to go on social media.
Okay,
but you
so
can give my number to whoever wants to contact me.
Okay, so we can do that off air. Maybe we can identify this person. So for the rest of the speakers, if you're on social media, you can just share your handles so that some of these people can get interactive with you. Dr. Idrisu, do you have a social media handle? Twitter, Instagram, Facebook?
No, I'm not on social media. You can give my number to anybody who wants it.
All right. Dr. Kennedy, your turn, sir.
Thank you. To Dr. Idrisu's point, age certainly is a number, but it matters. The youngest ever Prime Minister of Britain was William Pitt the Younger at 24, and he was a very good Prime Minister. Not only that, the best Chancellor Germany has ever had was Konrad Adenauer, and he was Chancellor in his 80s. So I think we should judge people based on competence rather than based on their age. And actually, most of the people who ran Africa into the ground were young men in their prime. Rawlins, Michael Barrow, all those generals, most of them were very young men. So I just say, let's look at what people can do rather than their ages. I think we need smaller, smarter government. And I want to share with you something somebody told me. I hope his family will forgive me. Late Jake Obeche Bilamte was my boss when I was working in the MPP, and he was a beloved guy. One day, I saw him a little downcast, and in a moment of candor, he told me something I've never forgotten. He said, because of what they did to my father, I hated politics for a long time. I joined it, I've done it for a long time, but I don't know whether maybe I should have left it alone, because between the two of us, more and more, our coming out of investment, which of them will get to steal from Ghana for the next 4 years. And those words were prophetic. I think as patriotic Ghanaians, we should always reflect on what Jake said. We need decentralized government, and we need integrity in our governance.
Right.
There are too many people in government who are there to loot resources from the public space into the private pockets of their cronies and their families. And that's part of why we are in trouble. We should invest vigorously in agriculture and tourism. Those two angles that will help us a lot. We have an angle on tourism, and I can foresee a national museum dedicated to slavery built in Accra. I can see a trip from Accra to Cape Coast where we've refurbished the castles, a trip to Asin where they used to give the slaves their last birth, and millions of people will trek there and bring a lot of money, and we must treat our diaspora community better.
Right.
No nation develop without the talent of their diaspora, and we should stop stupid policies like the National Cathedral. I thank you very much.
Dr. Foster, you have the final say. We really have to go, so please make it as brief as possible.
Well, I think doing the wrong things for the wrong reasons in the wrong ways has become the norm. So we need a fundamentally new rethinking a new mindset to approach governance with. And for me, that is what I'm looking out for in the 2024 election.
Right.
Is there anybody with a fundamentally new mindset? Will that lead to the fundamental reforms? Because you can only do what is in your mind. If it's not in your mind, you can't do it. If you don't have a mind that you've done something wrong and you need to change it, you only keep doing the wrong things. So I want to see a fundamentally new approach that will use the best of us and put Ghana's best foot forward. That is what I want to see happening. And then we can begin to address the many myriad of problems we have in a systematic way. Because until we do that, we will keep operating for partisan political advantage, doing the wrong things for the wrong reasons in the wrong ways. Thank you.
Paul Assam says, thank you for such an enlightening discussion. If you keep doing what you've always done, you'll keep getting what you've always got. Those who joined us for this conversation, Dr. Saad Idrisu, economist, Louisiana Economic Development, Professor Charles Aka, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Statistical, Social and Economic Research, Dr. Arthur Kobina Kennedy, political activist, and Dr. Abu Sakara Foster, founder, National Interest Movement. I cannot thank you enough, gentlemen, for making the time to join us this morning with your thoughts, your enlightenment, and your patriotism. Thank you so much. On now to our next conversation. The Media Foundation for West Africa, in partnership with the National Peace Council, the National Media Commission, and the National House of Chiefs, will host a public forum on the theme Media, Hate Speech, and Democratic Consolidation in Ghana. Now, there's a lot to discuss on this matter, and we'll be bringing that to you right after the break. Do stay.